Welcome to Before the Day Ends. So we're finishing up the first half, the story section of the third book of Matthew today in chapter 17, and we'll be turning to chapter 18 next time, which Jesus gets into some discussions about what he expects from his followers, his disciples, and of course us. So very important chapter in 18, so we'll get there beginning next time. Again, today we're in chapter 17. We just had the transfiguration. Jesus was on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, along with Moses and Elijah. Okay, this deep connection to Jesus with Moses on Mount Sinai. So again, a very big mountaintop experience. And now, immediately as Jesus is coming down the mountain, we're going to see him get back into the reality of daily life and how his disciples have been acting, what they've been doing while he's been gone, and then what that means when he returns. So take a look here in verse 14. When they came to the crowd, a man came to him, knelt before him, and said, Lord. Again, he calls him Lord. So he believes in him, he trusts him. Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. Jesus answered, You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I put up with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? He said to them, Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So, a bit different story this time. In this story, the boy can't be healed by his disciples. So, it's not that the condition of the boy was so bad that the disciples couldn't do it, or it wasn't that the boy didn't have enough faith, because we see that the father calls Jesus Lord. And we have examples of other people bringing someone to Jesus, like the centurion's servant who had faith in Jesus, and Jesus cures his servant at a distance, or the Canaanite woman we talked about a few weeks ago, that wants her daughter healed, and Jesus heals her at a distance. So we have Jesus doing these things at a distance for those who have faith in him. So we have a father, has faith, but his disciples can't heal. Why? Well, notice that it has to do with the crowd in many ways. The disciples themselves, but also the crowd. We've had this before. If you go back and take a look at Matthew 13, beginning in verse 54, we're going to turn there for a second. Jesus came to his hometown and began to teach the people in their synagogue, so that they were astounded and said, Where did this man get this wisdom and these deeds of power? Is not this the carpenter's son? And is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all this? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, Prophets are not without honor except in their own country and in their own house. And he did not do many deeds of power there, get this, because of their unbelief. So here again we have an example of healings not happening because of the unbelief of the crowd. So here in this story, it seems like the crowd isn't kind of buying into what Jesus is doing, and the disciples don't have the faith to do it. And again, we have another example of this. Remember when Peter walks on water and he begins to sink. Why did he sink? Well, remember, he had the faith to get out of the boat, but then he started paying attention to the winds and the waves, and he became divided. Right? He began to doubt in the sense that his mind was divided between seeing Jesus, seeing the winds, seeing the waves, seeing Jesus, and he begins to sink. So in many ways, what seems to be going on here is the disciples are also divided. Right? They got the crowd on one side, this boy on the other. Jesus isn't there with them. And maybe they were beginning to become divided. So one thing I want to point out in this story is the importance of friendships, of community. Because in a way, the crowd here is the winds and the waves in the Peter story. That who we surround ourselves with are the folks that we hang out with, that we call friends. Are they making us stronger in our faith? Are they helping us to see Jesus more clearly? Or are they a distraction? Are they dividing our loyalties? See, who we surround ourselves with matters. I think there's a lesson here for the early church and for us, that we need to surround ourselves with people that will draw us deeper into relationship with Christ. And the second thing in the story that's important is at the very end here, he says, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. I think too many people have taken this to be, well, if you have this quantity of faith, if you can fill up your faith bucket with enough faith, you can do what you want. Like faith is this kind of measurable quantity. That's not what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying that if you can't do something, it's because of your lack of faith, or you have to have a certain amount to do certain things. And this has been manipulated by people in the media. It's been by people with ill intentions to say that, well, you weren't healed or this didn't happen because you didn't have enough faith. You need to have more faith. Like again, you didn't fill up your bucket enough. That's not what he is saying here. He's saying you need to look and trust in me. And still, it's going to fall within God's will, right? Because sometimes God's answer in faith might be suffering. It might not be the answer that we want. We have to be aware of that too. We need to actually trust Jesus with the answer. That's what faith really is. In fact, look at what happens next in this story. Right? It talks about the mustard seed. It says, this is in verse 22, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and on the third day he'll be raised. And they were greatly distressed. Okay, so Jesus has all the faith possible, and yet it says right here, he's going to suffer. That sometimes faith is going to lead to suffering. We should be aware of that as well. It's not, faith isn't a get out of jail free card or something we can just call on to get whatever we want, whenever we want. Okay, last story in chapter 17. We're going to look at verse 24. When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? He said, yes, he does. And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, what do you think, Simon? From who do kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others? When Peter said, from others, Jesus said to him, then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a coin. Take that and give it to them for you and me. All right, a couple things. Number one, when I visited Israel, there's actually a fish restaurant on the Sea of Galilee. And when you buy a fish to eat, it comes on a plate, it's the whole fish, and of course in its mouth is a coin from this story. All right. So what's interesting here is this idea of not to offend. Right? Jesus is going to pay the temple tax, not because he has to, right? He's the Son of God, right? They're children of the King, and so therefore they don't have to pay the temple tax. It's a religious tax. But he says not to offend, right? We're going to go ahead and pay this tax. I think many times this idea of not giving offense gets manipulated. The first thing I want to say is notice that this is a religious act, right? This is the temple tax that they're talking about here. This is a religious thing. In the book of Romans, we have something similar to this. In Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 9, Paul is talking to the early church. And he starts off by saying, let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. And then he goes on to talk about kind of what that looks like, right? For example, he says, love one another with mutual affection, outdoing one another in showing honor. And then a little later he says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another, do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly, do not claim to be wiser than you are, do not pay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Right? So again, consider the group around you. Then he says this, for if it is possible, as far as depends on you, live peaceably with all. So again, we have this idea of trying to fit in, get along, as to live peaceably. In chapter 8 and 9 of 1 Corinthians, Paul talks to the church about food sacrificed to idols. This was kind of a big deal back then, that if food was sacrificed to idols, do you eat it or not eat it? And Paul said, well, there's no idols. They don't exist. Like, they're not really gods, so eat. But if you know people that are offended by that would cause them to stumble, then don't eat for their sake. Like, why would you want to kind of show them up, so to speak? So he says, in general, he says that the strong move to help the weak not stumble. Jesus says, don't cause my little ones to stumble. So we are to have care and compassion and to show peace and live peaceably with all as far as it depends upon us. Now, the truth is, sometimes it doesn't depend upon us. Sometimes people will not want to live peaceably. They're going to want to get their way regardless. And so we got to be careful to temper what Jesus is saying here, in the sense that there are those out there who are going to want to manipulate the situation and manipulate us. They're going to want to say, look, whatever I want you to do, you will do, because if you don't do what I want you to do, you'll cause me to stumble. So even things that aren't religious in nature, they'll say, well, if you don't do what I want, if you don't comply with my wishes or my perspective or my view on things, then you are causing me to stumble and therefore violating these commandments of Jesus. That is not what Jesus is saying. In fact, on many occasions, Jesus stands up for what is righteous. So we have to measure what is righteous in the eyes of God and then see how that applies to the world around us. That there are times when people are not going to want to be peaceable with us, and there's nothing we can do about that. The strong should move to help and support, encourage, and strengthen the weak. But the strong should not be ruled by the weak. We are to move to help those who are truly stumbling. We are not here to move at the whim of everyone's opinions or how they see things. That if we don't comply with what they want, we are causing them to stumble. That is not what is going on in this text. So it does call for some discernment on our part, that we have to discern, is this really causing someone to stumble? Or am I being manipulated morally? Am I being bullied morally to go along with what someone actually wants? Because it's really easy to do, right? We can kind of say, I don't want to cause a fight, I don't like conflict, and therefore I'm just going to kind of just give in and do whatever they say. That's not what's going on in this text, right? The first part is, surround yourself with those who encourage you and drive you closer to Christ. That's what this first part of the story is. The second part is, we do reach out into the world, and we have to be careful about how we do that. We want to live peaceably as far as it depends upon us, knowing that some folks are just not going to want to have peace unless they find it through our compliance. And that's not what is going on here in the Gospel of Matthew, or what Paul writes about later. So yes, we are to live peaceably with all as far as it depends upon us. What we can do about that within the framework of being disciples of Jesus. We'll see you next time as we jump into chapter 18 and a little bit more about how disciples are to live. We'll see you then.